Down through the rocks where the dark roots dry, the last long roots of the Glaston thorn. Dead is the king that never was born. Dead is the king that never shall die.
A few years ago, I had the privilege of visiting Glastonbury, England. There stand the ruins of what was once one of the most beautiful churches in England, if not the world, larger and lovelier than Canterbury Cathedral or Westminster Abbey. The Glastonbury Church and its adjacent monastery were savagely destroyed, its monks brutally executed by Henry VIII's men because the abbot would not submit to the king's takeover of the English churches. The land was taken from the church and given to an aristocrat who built a mansion for himself using the stones from the cathedral with a nice view of the ruins from his front windows. Glastonbury is the ancient seat of Christianity in England, going back farther than anyone can remember. In fact, there's a legend that Joseph of Arimathea visited Glastonbury. One of the pieces of evidence is the Glastonbury thorn, a tree native only to the Holy Land, but it grows in Glastonbury. And there are other people and events connected with this place whose stories are both shrouded and illuminated in the mists and the lights of legend. The most well-known is also the most tantalizingly unknown, the once and future king, who is part of England's memory even though he eluded the pages of its history, King Arthur. Glastonbury is the legendary site of Avalon. It's also the site of the grave of King Arthur. But like another famous grave in history, it's empty. One of the people who was involved in finding the famous empty grave in Glastonbury was a scholar by the name of Geoffrey Ashe. He's the world's foremost authority on King Arthur. Here I am, by the way, at Glastonbury, and with me are Geoffrey Ashe and his wife Patricia, who is from Alabama, of all places, and you might also recognize my son Julian and my daughter Ashley. Geoffrey Ashe painstakingly followed all the little historical clues that led to the discovery of the real King Arthur. Why did he believe that there was a real King Arthur when so many historians had assured us that he was a mere legend? Because Geoffrey Ashe read G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton writes convincingly of the importance of legend and even the reliability of legend in the absence of written records. But why is King Arthur so important? We're going to try to explain that right now. The first thing we have to try to understand is what Chesterton calls that unlettered interlude in history that is known as the Dark Ages. Most people are in dark about the Dark Ages, and there's some justification for that. It's a period in history of which we know very little. But many people have it confused with another period in history about which we know a great deal. They have the Dark Ages mixed up with the Middle Ages, which were anything but dark. The Dark Ages came before the Middle Ages. It's that period from roughly the 5th century and the fall of the Roman Empire to the 9th century and the rise of medieval Europe. During this time, there was very little written history, which is one of the reasons it's known as the Dark Ages. But the other reason is that the civilized world had largely fallen apart, conquered by barbarian tribes who behaved, quite frankly, like barbarians. They took whatever they wanted, they did whatever they liked, and they did away with whatever they didn't like. There was only one remnant of Roman civilization that remained to oppose the barbarians: the Roman Catholic Church. When Chesterton was in the midst of discovering the Christian faith, he had to deal with one of the common accusations against the church, namely that Christianity belongs to the Dark Ages, that it arose in a time of ignorance, and that the church would bring us back to that time if it could. But when he examined the actual historical facts rather than the suggestive modern generalizations, he found that the truth was precisely the other way around.
Christianity, so far from belonging to the Dark Ages, was the one path across the Dark Ages that was not dark. It was a shining bridge connecting two shining civilizations. If anyone says that the faith arose in ignorance and savagery, the answer is really quite simple. It didn't. It arose in the Mediterranean civilization in the full summer of the Roman Empire. The world was swarming then with skeptics. Pantheism was as plain as the sun when Constantine nailed the cross to the mast. Then, after being buried under the debris of dynasties and clans, we arose and remembered Rome. If our faith had been a mere fad of that fading empire, fad would have followed fad in the twilight. And if the civilization ever re-emerged, it would have been under some new barbaric flag. But the Christian church was the last life of the old society, and was also the first life of the new. She took the people who were forgetting how to make an arch, and she taught them to invent the Gothic arch. In a word, the most absurd thing that could be said of the church is the thing we have all heard said of it. How can we say that the church wishes to bring us back into the Dark Ages? After all, the church was the only thing that ever brought us out of them.
At the beginning of the Dark Ages, Rome was a slave state, with a huge portion of the population indentured to a small, wealthy ruling class. By the Middle Ages, slavery had disappeared. There was a large majority of free, self-sufficient peasants. At the beginning of the Dark Ages, there were no universities, no hospitals, no beautiful cathedrals. By the Middle Ages, all of these things had been developed, and most of those beautiful cathedrals still stand. As Chesterton says, it was the church that brought us out of the Dark Ages and brought about the return of civilization. We do not want to bring back the Dark Ages, but the Dark Ages have returned in spite of our efforts. Ask yourself, is our civilization improving or is it declining? For the last 2 centuries or so, that period that we'd call the modern world, the loudest thinkers have told us that we are improving, even rapidly improving. And this was in part because of the rise of industrialism and the impressive advances in technology and medicine and communication. How can we argue against that? Well, we can. We can start by admitting that the Industrial Revolution also brought with it great social blight and human oppression. That technology not only has given us bigger machines, but also bigger war machines and bigger wars. And even medicine, while giving us complex ways to preserve life, has also given us sophisticated ways to end life. That improved communications have allowed us to rapidly transmit a lot of rubbish, including obscenity and pornography, that's now completely out of control. And there are now all forms of electronic addiction, what you might call e-slavery, as we're handcuffed to laptops and cell phones and handhelds. We don't hear the counter-arguments because we assume that everything's getting better. We have unconsciously embraced the modern philosophy called progressivism, but its other name is Darwinism. G.K. Chesterton is one of the few truly prophetic thinkers who has said that our civilization is actually in decline, that the barbarians are the ones who are advancing.
I used to think that the chief modern danger was a danger of over-civilization. Now I am inclined to think that the chief modern danger is that of a slow return towards barbarism. Civilization in the best sense merely means the full authority of the human spirit over all externals. Barbarism, on the other hand, means the worship of those externals in their crude and unconquered state. Barbarism means the worship of nature. And in recent poetry, science, and philosophy, there has been too much of this worship of nature. Whenever men begin to talk much and with great solemnity about the forces outside man, the note of it is invariably barbaric. When men talk much about heredity and environment, they are almost almost barbarians. The modern men of science are many of them almost barbarians. That is why they remain squalid and unhappy, always talking about heredity, always talking about environment. Savages. Those that are truly stunted or depraved dedicate nearly all their tales and sayings to the subject of physical kinship, or of a curse of this or that tribe, of a taint in this or that family, of the invincible law of blood, of the unavoidable evil of places. The true savage, you see, is a slave, and is always talking about what he must do. The true civilized man, on the other hand, is a free man, and he is always talking about what he may do.
In other words, civilization is based on the dignity of man. And the dignity of man is based on the principle of free will. The basis of barbarism is determinism, that our fate is in the stars, or in the earth, or in our blood, but in something we cannot control. Blaming our behavior on our parentage, or on our poverty, or on our wealth, or on our weather is more evidence that we are moving into the new dark ages, that barbarism is growing. We keep looking for excuses to do whatever we want. We don't live in a truth-seeking age. We live in a pleasure-seeking age. But as Chesterton says, the very fury with which people go on seeking pleasure is a proof that they have not found it.
The problem with some modern writers is not that they attack all that is bad in civilization, but that they admire all that is bad in barbarism.
Chesterton is not surprised to see the artists and the sophisticates and the educated elite drawing nearer and nearer to savagery. They are purposely rebelling against civilization, not against its corruptions, but against its institutions, against marriage and courtesy and a code of justice. They follow the fatalistic tendencies of the savage and his temptations to be terrorized by the monstrous and the merely obscure. They are unhappy, they are restless, they are hostile, they are agnostic. In other words, they live in darkness. And yet they accuse the church of wanting to bring us back to the Dark Ages. Chesterton says it is the decisive people who are civilized. It is the indecisive, otherwise called the higher skeptics, or the idealistic doubters, who have remained barbarians. Even though they are unhappy and do not have a creed, there is still one thing they manage to believe in: youth and its beautiful energy. But Chesterton points out that this is also a sign of decadence.
The last statues that the Romans made were the statues of young barbarians.
We are faced with a possible triumph of the barbarians. We are faced with social anarchy. Barbarism is savagery. Everything's done on account of mere pleasure or pain, for loves and hatreds that are irrational, or what is worse, for likes and dislikes that are simply matters of taste. So there's no intellectual debate. There's a growing obsession with nature, natural impulses blamed or praised for everything. There's a vague goddess worship of Mother Nature. But the return to nature is not civilized. The first time the Dark Ages came around, it was only the church that was strong enough to drag us out of that abyss of barbarism. If we are facing a new Dark Ages, as it appears that we are, we will again need the church to carry us through it and out of it. In the last Dark Ages, says Chesterton, the arts and the sciences went into sanctuary. This was literally true. It was the monasteries that preserved man's cultural accomplishments and provided shelter for the good and the true and the beautiful during this barbarous transition. The attack of the barbarians is not so much against faith as against reason. There is a philosophical basis to civilization, that is, a reasonable basis. And that is what is being eroded by the new barbarians. Abortion is an attack against reason. It cannot be reasonably argued that an unborn baby is not protected by the same rights that protect every human being. Homosexual marriage is an attack against reason. It cannot be defended on any scientific or philosophical principles. It defies common sense. But the new barbarians do not want to discuss any of these things. They cannot defend them on the basis of reason, only on the basis of their savage desires. Chesterton says that in the new Dark Ages, there's another institution, in addition to the church, that must protect civilization, that must provide sanctuary. That institution is the family. And this is why he spent so much time defending the importance of private property.
I believe that at this historic crisis, property has become not only a just thing, but a sacred thing. Real property will be all the more sacred because it will be rather rare. It will be an island of Christian culture in seas of senseless drifting and mutable social moods. In short, I believe we have reached the time when the family will be called upon to play the part once played by the monastery. That is to say, there will retire into it not merely the peculiar virtues that are its own, but the crafts and creative habits which once belonged to all sorts of other people.
What does all this have to do with King Arthur? What do we even know about King Arthur? According to Chesterton, King Arthur was celebrated by every generation of English culture since the Middle Ages. But in the modern ages, his position has become sketchy. Tennyson and the Victorians look back on King Arthur with a kind of wistful feeling, a lost romance. Mark Twain, ironically, derided King Arthur's court as something barbaric. Chesterton says that Mark Twain did not happen to know that the only reason why that court has made a half entry into history is that it stood for the remnant of high civilization against the base advance of barbarism. In more recent times, the legend has been twisted into all sorts of different things, mostly for entertainment, from a really bad Broadway musical to a pretty good Disney cartoon and a rather irreverent Monty Python spoof. But Chesterton argues that the legendary King Arthur must be based on a real King Arthur. And he had to have been one of the heroes of the Dark Ages, which seems cause enough for such a huge legend.
Historically speaking, the point about a popular legend is whatever it was that made it popular. Most people are interested in the hero because he is the hero, or in other words, because he is heroic. No other explanation is really necessary, and all other explanations fail to explain. The very earliest historical references to Arthur are references to what he did. And what he did was to defend Britain as a Christian and civilized state against the heathen invasions. The very first references to him deal with stories like that of the Battle of Mount Badon, in which Arthur drove the heathen before him and carried a holy image.
Among the things from the Arthurian legend that strike Chesterton as having the ring of truth are the references to people and places and objects, not as mere abstractions, but as actualities. He says, when we want to ask in natural language whether a thing really exists or not, we ask if it is really there or not. We say there, even if we do not clearly understand where there is. And the point about Arthur is there really is a there. The modern objection, the modern doubts about the court of Camelot, says Chesterton, are founded on the notion that anything so far back in time must itself have been barbaric. The truth is that if it was far enough back, it almost certainly would have been civilized. It would have been the last phase of the old Roman civilization. If you go back far enough into the night, you get to the previous day. If you go far enough back into the Dark Ages, you get to the light still coming from Rome.
King Arthur stands in Britain at once as the first of the Britons and the last of the Romans.
There are three important objects associated with Arthur that explain both his legendary status and his real importance. The first is his sword. The second is the Round Table, and the third is the Holy Grail. They represent the three things needed to preserve a civilization: purposeful craftsmanship, political order, and authentic religion. We could talk a long time about Arthur's famous sword, Excalibur, but we will confine ourselves to what Chesterton says about it.
On every sword that is made by man ought to be graven the two mysterious phrases which were on the fairy sword of King Arthur. On one side was written, "Take me," and on the other side, "Cast me away." If no more than this dim fable recalled the doubtful hero of Camelot, we should know that he defended Christendom against the heathen. For the highest mark of Christian civilization is his capacity for feeling that the sword is at once noble and unnatural. People talk of drawing the sword and throwing away the scabbard, but when it is drawn really splendidly, one always feels that the swordsman may throw away the sword as well.
The sword is the symbol of two-edged truth. Defense is a duty, but we must hold the sword and not let the sword hold us. So too, we must control our machines and not let our machines control us. We must be willing to use our tools, but also willing to cast them away. The second object associated with Arthur is the Round Table, which Chesterton says represents heroic comradeship, the image of men who are willing to feast together, to argue together, to serve together, and to govern together. While the sword is a symbol of war, the table is a symbol of peace. A round table is a symbol not only of universality, but of equality. The third and most mysterious object associated with Arthur is the Holy Grail. There was a legend that Joseph of Arimathea came to England and brought with him the chalice from the Last Supper. This most sacred of vessels was lost during the time of barbarism, the Dark Ages, but Joseph appeared to King Arthur and sent him on a quest to find it. The Holy Grail, obviously, is a symbol that is more than a symbol of Christ's blood, of the sacraments of the church, of the reality of the Christian revelation. The sacramental nature of the Catholic faith, the idea that something spiritual and eternal is embodied in something physical and ephemeral, is a great mystery. And it must have been even more profound of a mystery when the idea was still new. We have a supernatural encounter every time we attend Mass, but the legend that King Arthur had a supernatural encounter adds a certain spiritual thrill to his story.
The thrill is that there is some strange spot where the sky touches the earth, or where eternity contrives to live on the borderland of time and space.
Chesterton says that the legendary King Arthur seems even more real than the historical King Alfred. Indeed, most people have heard of King Arthur but haven't heard of King Alfred, the 9th century king who fought off the barbarians and saved Christendom, which is why he's called Alfred the Great, the only English king with that grand title. Chesterton's epic poem, The Ballad of the White Horse, describes Alfred's dramatic victory over the barbarians. It's a poem that everyone should study, a masterpiece of literature, and it includes an important lesson from history. But it's also a poem that ends with a prophecy. Alfred predicts that the barbarians will return, not in warships, not with blood on their hands, but with books as weapons and with ink on their hands. They will bring ruin and darkness again, but they will do it with destructive ideas.
By being bound to nothing, being slaves without a lord, by one blind idiot world obeyed, too blind to be abhorred, by terror and the cruel tales of curse in bone and kin, by weird and weakness winning, accursed from the beginning, by detail of the sinning and denial of the sin.
Chesterton says, we are now fighting a new and false religion that may almost be called a religion of irreligion. It trusts itself utterly to the anarchy of the unknown. It will destroy civilization again unless we stop it. Which brings us to the final point of why King Arthur is important. He is called the once and future king because of the legend that he will return. We will need such heroes in the new dark ages. We will need to be such heroes.
There is a glorious side to social decline. Its name is King Arthur. We are beginning to understand what it would mean to stand up to the last for the higher ideals of social reform amid a world going down into ruin, negation, and apathy. Beginning to realize what it means to be men of the barbarian decline, to resist that decline and fight for civilization and citizenship, and why they remained through the darkness of the barbarian end, burning and shining lights of the legends of romance and stories of chivalry. They remained that because they fought to save civilization. It is well that they should still fight for their civilization and to the last, even if they thought it was going down. They would thus be more prepared when the great things returned.
Chesterton says, if there are ghastly things to be faced, the only thing we can do is make it glorious to face them. I'm Dale Ahlquist. Thank you for joining us on the Apostle of Common Sense. And please, support the American Chesterton Society. Help us make common sense more common.